very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind reception. I appreciate it very much. It is great to be back. Fred Anton, I don't know where you've gone, Fred, but I know you're here somewhere. And I am really grateful for your leadership. I have described Fred as the father of the conservative movement in Pennsylvania, and he has corrected me. He is the grandfather of the conservative movement in Pennsylvania, and God bless him. David Taylor, thank you for that kind introduction and for your outstanding leadership of PMA and just the great work you're doing. Loman Henry, once again, another very successful. How about for Loman? Absolutely. And it's great to be back. I had quite a streak of being here every single year. We had a scheduling conflict last year, and so for me, it's wonderful to be back. David made a reference to the campaign and the election last year. Let me tell you, that was quite a battle, and I am very grateful for your support in getting across the goal line. It was, in fact, in the end, the most expensive Senate race in the history of the Republic, and there was over $90 million of ads spent attacking me, and that has a number of interesting consequences. One is, I used to pretty typically be able to walk down most streets in Pennsylvania in relative anonymity. $90 million worth of TV ads later, not so much. When you combine that fact with the fact that Congress had an approval rating of maybe, I don't know, 11%, and let's face it, that's family and friends. Well, that combination of ubiquitous TV ads and a very low approval rating would lead to some awkward conversations. I'll give you an example. One day I was walking through Home Depot with my son. I'm walking down the aisle. During the middle of the campaign, I was there on a Saturday running some errands. Walking down the aisle, and there's a guy coming towards me, the other end of the aisle. He's coming towards me. As he's getting closer and closer, he keeps looking at me, and he's looking at me, he's looking, and he stops and says, "Hey, has anyone ever told you you look a lot like Pat Toomey?" I said, "Yeah, I've heard that." He looked at me and he said, "Must be infuriating." So, it's just fine with me that the campaign is over. Listen, David Taylor mentioned that I wanted to speak about the situation we find ourselves in with Neil Gorsuch, and I want to talk about his candidacy for the Supreme Court, where we are, and what I think is going to happen next week. This is the next item up on the agenda in the United States Senate, and it will dominate next week. Now, there's a lot of debate, and our friends on the other side of the aisle have indicated that they are not supportive of Neil Gorsuch. Let me start with the things about which there is no debate, the items about which I have heard no criticism. Nobody has suggested that Neil Gorsuch doesn't have the intellect and the education to do this job. He went to Columbia undergrad, Harvard Law School, Oxford for postgraduate work. The fact is, the guy is brilliant. He has a brilliant mind. Nobody's disputed that. Second thing that I have not heard is anyone suggest that he somehow doesn't have experience. He has spent 10 years on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. That's a lot of experience. Nobody disputes that. He's also a man of just a tremendous character and temperament and integrity, and nobody disputes this. In fact, everybody who knows him has spoken about what a truly good and decent and honorable man he is. And he has had bipartisan support. You know, back when he was considered for the 10th Circuit, his nomination was put on the Senate floor for consideration. There was not a single dissenting voice in the entire Senate when it came to confirming Neil Gorsuch to the 10th Circuit. Even now, Barack Obama's acting Solicitor General has endorsed Neil Gorsuch. And there are a number of letters have been circulated, written and signed by former colleagues of his, classmates of his, folks that span the ideological and political spectrum who all endorse Neil Gorsuch. So it's certainly not his intellect, education, experience, character. It's none of that. So what are the attacks that we've heard against Neil Gorsuch. One that we hear occasionally is this idea, well, some have said he's out of the mainstream. We've heard that from some of our Democratic colleagues, that Neil Gorsuch is out of the mainstream. Well, it's going to be hard for them to make that case. Here's why. It is the nature of the circuit courts, the appellate courts, that judges on those courts don't rule alone. They rule either as one of three judges or as the entire court. That's the way the circuit courts work. And so it's very easy to see, was he an outlier? Was he routinely the outlier who disagreed with everyone else? It's empirically very simple to determine that. Well, Neil Gorsuch ruled in over 2,700 cases in his 10 years on the court. In 99% of those cases, he was in the majority. 99. 97%, they were unanimous. How could he possibly be outside the mainstream? Of course he's not. There's another charge that's been levied against him, and this one I think bears a little more scrutiny. This is the notion that we have heard, in particular from the Senate Democratic Minority Leader, where he handpicks a handful of cases of the 2,700 plus cases that Neil Gorsuch has ruled on, and then points to those in which Neil Gorsuch didn't rule in favor of the people that Chuck Schumer believes are politically sympathetic. Let me quote you from Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer's floor speech, in which he said, and I quote, he's referring to Neil Gorsuch, he says, "I saw a judge who repeatedly decided with insurance companies that wanted to deny disability benefits to employees. I saw a judge who, in unemployment discrimination, sided with employers the great majority of the time. Time and again, his rulings favor the already powerful over ordinary Americans." The Democratic leader went on to say, and I quote, "Judge Gorsuch ruled against a teacher. Judge Gorsuch ruled against a truck driver." Now let's think about this. So even if you ignore the distorted facts that they've used even in those cases, if you ignore the fact that even in those cases there were Democratic judges that Chuck Schumer supports who sided with Neil Gorsuch, if you ignore the fact that in some of the cases they cite as evidence that Neil Gorsuch was a bad judge, he was bound by precedent. He had no choice but to rule as he did. If you ignore the many other cases where he, in fact, ruled in favor of workers and unions and women alleging sexual harassment, environmentalists, immigrants, other sympathetic litigants. Ignore all those. What's striking about the criticism to me, the criticism levied by Senator Schumer against Neil Gorsuch, what's most striking is what's missing. You notice what's missing is any reference to the law. He didn't say anything about the law. The critics of Neil Gorsuch have never said that Neil Gorsuch ignored the law, or that he violated the law, or that he misapplied the law, or that he misunderstood the law. Now, why is it that they don't talk about his approach to the law? I would suggest that to some of his most vocal critics, it's because the law isn't really what matters the most. See, that's the problem with some of the folks who are so harshly critical of Neil Gorsuch. What matters the most to them is that they get their preferred policy outcome and that their politically favored or perceived to be sympathetic litigant wins. That's what matters most to them, regardless of what the law actually says. See, folks, I think that the harshest critics of Neil Gorsuch really oppose him because of two unpardonable sins in their minds that Neil Gorsuch has committed. The first is that Neil Gorsuch believes in the rule of law. You know, that is a fundamental part of this debate between his supporters and his opponents. It's a fundamental debate over the role of judges under the U.S. Constitution. And one view, the view that I hold, the view that I know Judge Gorsuch holds, is that the law, including the Constitution, means exactly what it says. Nothing more and nothing less. And further, we believe that the law can change when the American people want the law to change, and they do so through their elected representatives. Furthermore, and this is just as important, a judge should see everyone the same. Regardless of race, sex, wealth, political affiliation, a judge is supposed to neutrally apply the law. It doesn't matter whether you're white or black, man or woman, rich or poor, young or old. There's a reason why our symbol of justice is Lady Justice, and she's depicted blindfolded. It's because she's not determining the outcome of a decision based on the appearance of the person before her. That's essential to our American judicial system. But the critics of Neil Gorsuch, if you listen carefully to what they say, the critics clearly have implicitly rejected this notion of equality before the law. Some people are more equal than others in their view of the world. And the law means whatever a judge believes it should mean, based in part on who the litigants are. The Constitution, of course, that can't mean what it actually says. That would be very inconvenient for them. And so, and this is important, Senator Schumer and his colleagues who are leading this effort against Neil Gorsuch, what they really want is the Supreme Court to be a permanently sitting constitutional convention that can rework the Constitution to get the policy outcomes they want. In Chuck Schumer's America, judges are acutely aware of race and sex and wealth and political affiliation and political connections, and those items matter in the outcome of decisions. In that view of the world, America has a subservient judiciary. It is subservient to the political class. In fact, you could ask yourself, in that view of the world, if that's the way it's supposed to work, why do we even bother to have trials? Why do we even bother with trials, right? Couldn't we just instead decide if the litigants are members of a preferred or particularly sympathetic class, then they're automatically favored? You know, maybe some of my colleagues in the Senate, some of my Democratic colleagues could do is they could helpfully provide us with a list. You know, which categories of people are the preferred people of the day, and share that with the judges, and so we know the outcome of cases before they go to trial, right? This is implicitly what they're advocating for. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, there are judicial systems around the world that operate that way. They're called banana republics, and the United States of America doesn't run its judiciary that way. So I pose these two views of how we approach the law. In the first view, the view that I hold, is often described as originalism, because the idea is that the words in a law, the words in the Constitution, have the meaning that they originally had, and they continue to have that meaning permanently until the words themselves are changed. That's the idea. The second view, of course, the critics' view, is that the Constitution is a living document, right? It's living, it's breathing, it's changing all the time. You can watch it right in front of your eyes. Folks, the choice between these two is a choice of whether or not we will be ruled by law or ruled by judges. Justice Scalia, the great Justice Scalia, said, and I quote, "Every tin-horn dictator in the world today, every president for life has a Bill of Rights. The point is that the Bill of Rights and the rest of the Constitution only protect us if they are equally enforced for all." Yeah, how much protection does our Constitution provide us? How much protection do we have in the Bill of Rights if, as Chief Justice Hughes stated in 1907, and I quote, "The Constitution is what the judge says it is"? Justice Scalia observed that once the original meaning of the Constitution can be set aside and a judge can rewrite it, then they can rewrite anything, and that is a direct threat to our liberty. Let me give you a very simple, clear example. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution states very clearly that the government can't take private property unless it is, quote, for public use. In the Kelo decision, 5 justices said that for public use can mean for private use. That's what they said. They specifically said in this case that the government can confiscate an individual's house and hand it over to a private developer who intended to use it as a parking lot. A private business that had another purpose for the house. That's blatantly unconstitutional. It's not a close call. But 5 justices thought that, well, you know, the developer will put it to a better use, we think, and so we'll just overrule the Constitution. We'll ignore it. Now, under the originalist view of the world, the view that I hold, that I think Neil Gorsuch holds, judges don't get to rewrite the Constitution. That is not their job, even if they think that the policy outcome would be good. So, for instance, you might believe that it's a good idea to allow the government to confiscate someone's house and give it to a developer. I don't, but someone might. If that is their view, we have a mechanism for changing the Constitution. We've done it 17 times. You amend the Constitution. But the important thing is, you don't have 5 people in robes who are unaccountable do that. The American people do it through the mechanism that gives them some say. Now, why is it so important? Why is it so important that we insist that policy changes can only be carried out by the elected branches of government and not by the judicial? It's actually, after all, it's one of the 3 branches of the government. These are very, very capable people. They're very qualified. I'll tell you why. It goes to the heart of what the United States is all about. It's a question of who's sovereign. If the American people are sovereign, then they get to decide. And the reason that we leave policy decisions to elected representatives is because we're the ones who are accountable to the people. If I pursue policies that the Pennsylvania people disagree with, I will not get reelected. I will be held accountable. I will be fired. What are you going to do if Ruth Bader Ginsburg gives a ruling that you disagree with? She's there for life. This is why the fundamental part of our design, the fundamental part of a representative democracy, a republic, a constitutional form of government necessarily requires judges have this limited role. Neil Gorsuch understands this. His critics refuse to accept this. But I said there were 2 unpardonable sins in the minds of some of my colleagues with respect to Neil Gorsuch. I just described the first. The second is the fact that he was nominated by Donald Trump. I'm telling you, that is a problem for some folks. There is a subset within the American political system that cannot accept the outcome of the election that occurred last fall. And so they are pushing Democratic senators as hard as they can to reflexively oppose anything and anyone that Donald Trump wants to nominate or anything he wants to do. Some have suggested even that this seat needs to stay open for the duration of the Trump presidency. Can you imagine? No. They're saying this. Let me quote the minority leader, Democratic minority leader Chuck Schumer, in an interview said, and I quote, "It's hard for me to imagine a nominee for the Supreme Court that Donald Trump would choose that would get Republican support that we could support." And when he was asked as a follow-up question, "So you'll do your best to hold the seat open?" he replied, "Absolutely." Folks, this is outrageous. Now let me cut right to where some of my colleagues immediately go in this discussion. They say, "Well, wait a minute, Merrick Garland. You didn't confirm Merrick Garland last year, so it's the same thing." It is not the same thing. First of all, when we decided that the American people should decide how to fill the vacancy that occurred last year on the Supreme Court, we were invoking the Schumer rule. We're invoking the Schumer rule. You remember, not with 8 months to go, but with 18 months to go in the George W. Bush administration, Chuck Schumer took to the Senate floor and said, if a vacancy on the Supreme Court should open now, the Democratic-controlled Senate should not even consider hearings or any way of moving forward on the nominee. That was Chuck Schumer. 18 months, I think that's pretty extreme. But we said with 8 months to go, in the heat of a presidential campaign, when the entire elected government is about to be chosen by the American people, our constitutional obligation to provide advice and consent is a meaningless concept if it can't be withheld, our decision was we should withhold our consent until the American people have spoken and decided whom they want in the White House and whom they want in control of the United States Senate, and then we should confirm the person that that president selects. But now, Senator Schumer is threatening to do something that is completely unprecedented in the history of the Republic, and that is to conduct a partisan filibuster to deny a nominee to the Supreme Court. This has never been done before. There was a bipartisan filibuster on Abe Fortas in the 1960s. It was bipartisan because there were ethical challenges that Abe Fortas faced. In fact, he even had to resign as a result of them. Very different set of circumstances. But go through case by case, every justice that is now sitting or has been considered for the Supreme Court either got over 60 votes or never had to get over the 60-vote threshold. Even Clarence Thomas, okay? The most controversial Supreme Court justice of my lifetime, brutal hearings, extremely contentious. It was very, very, very bitter and a very, very tough moment. Clarence Thomas' vote on the Senate floor was confirmed 52 to 48. 52 votes. Any senator could have demanded 60, and Clarence Thomas would not have gotten 60 votes. Ted Kennedy could have demanded 60. Joe Biden could have demanded 60. Pat Leahy, who is still serving in the Senate, could have demanded 60. But nobody did because it was never done. It has never been done. And now Chuck Schumer is arguing that because President Obama's nominees got over 60 votes, Neil Gorsuch needs to get over 60 votes. This is just laughable because he knows the reason President Obama's nominees got over 60 votes is because some Republicans were willing to supply the votes. He is not willing to supply the votes for Donald Trump's nominee, for a very good and decent and qualified man in Neil Gorsuch. So you don't have to trust me on this, though. The Washington Post, which last time I checked is not exactly the mouthpiece of the RNC, the Washington Post did their fact-checking on Chuck Schumer's claim that 60 votes is the standard. They gave him 3 Pinocchios for that claim. So, by the way, it's a little hard to be sympathetic when some of my Democratic colleagues imply they would never do this if they were in our situation. Seriously. These are the very same guys who in 2013 changed the rules of the Senate so that a simple majority could confirm all non-Supreme Court nominees. And why did they do that? Because they had to pack the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals with judges who would be a rubber stamp for President Obama. Seriously. But not only that, 12 days before the last election, remember when our Democratic friends were convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to win and they were going to take control of the Senate, a reporter asked Tim Kaine, the vice presidential nominee, what would they do if Republicans launched a filibuster against a Clinton Supreme Court nominee? And Tim Kaine responded without hesitance. He said, and I quote, "We will change the Senate rules to uphold the law that the court will have 9 members." So they told us what they would do. Listen, let me wrap up with this. I think the case in favor of Neil Gorsuch is overwhelming. I don't think Donald Trump could have picked a better person for the Supreme Court of the United States. Another editorial board, not exactly a subsidiary of the RNC, the Chicago Tribune, in their endorsement of Neil Gorsuch said, and I quote, "Here is a judge who knows the law and knows the role of the judiciary. He isn't on the bench to make law. He's there to interpret it faithfully because the separation of powers among the branches of government serves our democracy. Sometimes the results benefit liberal positions, sometimes conservative. Some of Gorsuch's critics think judges should be creative and expansive, depending on the political climate, to treat laws differently on a cold day than on a warm one. Those critics suggest that they fear Gorsuch won't follow the law, but the opposite is more true. They fear he will. Neil Gorsuch should be confirmed." End quote. Folks, I'm here to tell you today, if my Democratic colleagues won't vote to confirm Neil Gorsuch, then there is no Republican that they are willing to vote to confirm. And we cannot allow a Democratic minority to block an up or down vote and deny the opportunity to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court for 4 or 8 years. So next week, on Monday, the Senate Judiciary Committee is going to vote to favorably report Neil Gorsuch and recommend him to the Supreme Court. We will have a motion on the Senate floor to end debate and move on to confirmation. To succeed, that motion requires 60 votes. We're going to have that vote. I think there will be some Democratic senators who will vote to end debate so that we can move on and confirm him with the simple majority that it should take. However, Senator Schumer has indicated that he is confident that they have the votes to prevent us from getting to 60 votes, to prevent us from ever being able to confirm Neil Gorsuch. Let me just tell you today, the Republican majority in the United States Senate, the majority that you helped elect, we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that Neil Gorsuch is confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States. Thank you very much. Thank you for your support. I hope you have a terrific conference.